September 12, 2025.
At 0025 at Primorsk Oil Port on the Baltic shoreline, two enormous Shadow Fleet tankers lay idle, preparing to take on millions of barrels of crude. Abruptly, an extraordinary glitch lit up the display of a Nebo-M long-range VHF radar station positioned several hundred kilometers to the south. More than 70 unidentified contacts, each with a reduced radar cross-section, were converging on Russian airspace. Their origin stretched out to roughly 1,000 kilometers, and their combined potential charge exceeded 3 tons of high explosives. Alarms began to howl at the Leningrad Oblast Air Defense Command when the readings were corroborated by the 91N6E Big Bird wide-area surveillance radar. The operation had been conceived months earlier in a planning suite in Kiev. The 1,000-kilometer standoff posed its own difficulties. Yet the principal barrier was Russia's formidable air defense umbrella, described even by NATO as an A2/AD bubble, arrayed along that corridor. Russian commanders remained composed. This moment was exactly what their layered systems were engineered to repel. Moscow's 3-tier integrated air defense architecture responded seamlessly. The 92N6E engagement radars of S-400 batteries encircling St. Petersburg began to acquire and track contacts one after another. At lower levels, Pantsir S-1 batteries met incoming nodes with a literal wall of metal, belching the murderous hail of twin 2A38 30mm cannon fire capable of some 5,000 rounds per minute into the sky. Yet the turmoil the Russians observed was not random. It was a vast, geographically surgical deception. To lure the umbrella away from Primorsk, waves of decoys were steered toward the villages of Zilovsk, Tosnau, Pakhovskoy, and Uzmino, and the Luminosov quarter of Leningrad Oblast. Simultaneously, the Valasovsky, Tosnki, Gachinsky, Linosovsky, and Pushkinsky districts of St. Petersburg were baited, monopolizing the attention of the region's most powerful S-400 batteries.
Yachinsky, a junior lieutenant, watched the last contact in his sector wink out of his scope and dutifully radioed his routine status up the chain. "Sector clear, all targets eliminated." That message, as it ascended through command, became the genesis of the commander's gravest error. What felt like triumph was in truth a snare. For this elaborate stratagem, over 70 unmanned systems had been allocated to Leningrad and its environs. Of those, 35 AQ-400 variants were assigned the diversionary role against St. Petersburg. The other 40 comprised the principal wave destined to disperse across Leningrad Oblast. Central to this grouping were 15 UJ-26 Boba ERS, tasked with striking Primorsk's port. The plan's success hinged on a subset of the 40 breaching the infernal curtain of fire and reaching their objective. Every technical element's suitability was decisive for execution. The UJ-26 Boba ERS forming the strike cell were chosen expressly for this sortie. The standard Boba's range could not meet the requirement. The ER extended range models, however, were the only kamikaze platforms within the Ukrainian inventory capable of a one-way, 1,000-kilometer sortie carrying a 40-kilogram warhead, enabled by auxiliary fuel tanks and tuned engine software. A comparable solution was engineered for the electronic warfare platforms designated Banshee 7, which operated in a supporting capacity. Standard EW drones lacked the endurance to accompany the strike cell over the required distance. Consequently, Banshee 7 airframes were constructed on the same extended-range hull as the Boba ER, outfitted with sophisticated jamming pods and extra antenna in lieu of explosive payloads. Their objective was straightforward: escort the Boba strike drones the full 1,000-kilometer leg
to the objective. The AQ-400 Scythe was selected as the decoy for its sheer simplicity. Its plywood construction not only yielded a diminished radar signature, but also enabled rapid, low-cost mass manufacture. Producing the many airframes required for a saturation barrage, therefore, became economically and logistically feasible. At midnight, in excess of 70 unmanned systems launched from multiple Ukrainian sites and began low-level ingress into Russian airspace. The opening hours passed in complete radio silence as the drones traced the terrain. Relying on preloaded digital terrain elevation models, they hugged river valleys and wooded corridors to remain beneath the principal Russian radar envelopes. This phase represented a severe trial of each unit's autonomous navigation stack. A number of drones were lost en route, colliding with landscape features or failing mechanically. Losses anticipated and accepted by planners from the operation's inception. Once across the border, the operational paradigm shifted. Concealment became secondary to execution. When the Russian air defense complex became fully alert, it reacted exactly as Kyiv's planners had forecast. As the 91N6E Big Bird arrays registered the vast but dispersed swarm spreading in from hundreds of kilometers, the system automatically prioritized the cluster it assessed as the principal threat, the 35 vectors steering towards St. Petersburg. The volley of 48 N6 series interceptors fired from S-400 launchers hunted down those inexpensive plywood decoys sequentially. From Moscow's perspective, this was textbook interception. For the Ukrainians, it was the intended first sacrifice on a larger chessboard. Simultaneously, the remaining 40 drones scattering through Leningrad Oblast entered a lethal game of cat and mouse with Pantsir and Buk systems. Near Volosovsky, a Pantsir S-1 battery acquired a low-flying UJ-26 Boba. Its 1R S-2-1E tracking radar provided a clean track, and the Russian crew watched full telemetry on their fire control display. Crucially, the Ukrainian controller also observed that radar's lock indicator on his own terminal. He stayed composed because approximate Banshee 7 had already countered. Detecting the Pantsir's X-band emissions, the Banshee unleashed a jamming barrage on that frequency so intense the Russian display immediately saturated to white. The lock dissolved. In desperation, the crew fired the twin 2A 38 30mm guns, but the Boba had already threaded through the curtain of rounds and vanished into the night. That pattern repeated throughout the sortie. Russian forces were tenacious and lethal. By the time the engagement moved towards central Leningrad, their defensive fires had downed 33 drones in a fusillade of metal and flame. All drones aimed at downtown St. Petersburg were neutralized, losses which, for Ukraine, had been incorporated into the operation's calculus from the start. Each drone that plunged opened a narrow window for the one trailing behind to exploit. As the lieutenant relayed his status, from the blind corridor carved out by the barrage and clatter, a strike cell of only 7 specially modified UJ-26 Boba ERS had slipped past the principal defensive belt. Those 7 were poised to act like surgical scalpels, each bearing a 40-kilogram armor-piercing warhead aimed at the economic vitals of the state. The Russian High Command was fixated on a corner of an enormous tableau and were on the verge of missing the whole composition. At 4:45, Primorsport's own Pantsir battery was taken aback when 7 faint contacts popped onto its screen and accelerated inwards, catching crews unprepared. In a flurry, it opened up and 57 E6 interceptors streaked from the tubes. Yet the targets were too low, too swift, and too proximal. The 7 Bobas divided into 2 elements and executed a terminal split over the harbor. 3 bore down on the pumping station. the port's circulatory core. One of those three was torn from the sky by the Pantsir's missiles just a few hundred meters shy of its aim. That struck became the Russians' final solace that night. The two survivors in that flight path dived and completed their tasks. The first, loaded with a TBG-7V thermobaric charge, slammed into the station's principal control block. The detonation consumed the oxygen within the enclosed volume and spawned a colossal overpressure that blew the structure's walls outward. Seconds later, the second dove into the main pipeline manifold. The twin detonations severed the port's arteries. Concurrently, the remaining 4 bombers locked on to 2 tankers moored at the berth. 2 peeled off for the Kapitan Lob. The lead drone, fitted with a KZ-6-style explosive, hit just beneath the vessel's bridge, annihilating all onboard electronic systems. The follow-on struck a primary cargo tank brimming with oil, igniting an immense conflagration. The other pair targeted the Sergei Gorskov with nearly identical profiles, one into the engine room, the other into the loading manifolds. In total, 4 UAVs impacted 2 Aframax-class tankers of the Shadow Fleet, Kusto and Kylan. Kusto was operated by Solstice Corp with a deadweight tonnage of 115,000. Kylan was registered to Axaronics Limited and listed at 110,000 DWT. Both flagged under suspicious registries in international maritime insurance ledgers. They were on the loading line at the moment of strike. When the drones struck, loading was nearing completion, and then the inferno erupted. The blaze was strategic in scope because it hit not merely storage volumes but the very heart of the shipping infrastructure. 42 seconds after the first blast, the second detonated, and Primorsk Port's No. 2 pumping station collapsed.
A third drone punched through the port control's upper facade.
A short circuit sent the entire facility into emergency shutdown, but the command could not propagate because the energy control core had been demolished. The 4th and 5th drones focused on the tanker's stern loading arms.
Flames erupted aboard the Kusto as fuel began pouring from the Kylun.
The 6th and 7th strikes hit the pump valve complex, after which firefighting control was rendered impossible. Primorsk went up like vapor. Within minutes, the port had become an inferno. 2 colossal tankers aflame and a shattered pumping station. Hours after the assault, the Russian Defense Ministry proclaimed that 221 Ukrainian drones had been downed nationwide overnight and that all incursions had been repulsed. Those tallies, however, were rendered hollow by satellite imagery over Primorsk that revealed damage measured in the billions. The strikes had been far from indiscriminate. Primorsk alone handled roughly 20% of Russia's seaborne oil exports. The targeted Aframax-class tankers, each with an approximate capacity of 700,000 barrels, were linchpins of the Shadow Fleet used to evade sanctions. The port enabled roughly $15 billion in annual oil exports. Primorsk's oil served as the conduit for barrelized shipments that are difficult to trace and even harder to police, funneled to international shadow fleets. Shutting that channel struck directly at Russia's war chest. With average daily shipments near 1 million barrels, the hit equated to an estimated $70 to $80 million lost each day.